Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the first chapter in the book of Daniel. Daniel is the fourth and final of the prophets who are categorized as major, and even though there's only 12 chapters in his book, whereas there are 14 for Hosea, who is the first minor prophet so designated, it really packs a stunt punch. There's a lot of far-sighted visions, some of which have yet to be fulfilled that we read about in here, and also some which would be immediately fulfilled some centuries after they were reigned, and even a few that he interpreted in dreams with long-range visions. So this is all the types of stuff we read in here. And Daniel was also more than a prophet. He was also a prime minister, or the functional equivalent thereto, first to Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler and king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, then Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, from Babylon. So he spent his first 15 years in Judea. He was a native of Judea. Then he was picked off in one of the waves where Nebuchadnezzar, he defeated, before he finally destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, he did defeat the city and the state of Judah several times in battle, and each time he did, he took more and more people and more stuff with him. So Daniel was amongst one of the earlier waves, 605 BM, before Messiah Ezekiel was taken in 597 BM, and the temple and city itself would be destroyed in 586 BM. But if that is correct, then he would have been 83 years old when he recorded the 10th and 12th chapter of this book, which are the latest written. Those are the closing chapters, and he would have written them when they were 83. So his majority of his lifespan was spent in Babylon. And that is no excuse not to be a righteous remnant, because the fire of prophecy did not extinguish for the Jews at this time. It was burning brightly through Daniel and Ezekiel. In the 3rd year of the king of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Nebuchadnezzar always had his eye on Jerusalem. That is something he wanted. He was a conqueror. He was an empire builder, and Jerusalem would have been a prized possession from him. And Zedekiah was the final king, of whom we read, the one who had his eyes gouged out. He was the last on the line of David to sit on the throne. But before him was Jehoiakim. And so this would have been the wholesale conquest, but he would have besieged it and taken a few things and a few people. And Yahweh gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the utensils of the house of Elohim, which he brought to the land of Shinar, to the house of his mighty one. And he brought the utensils into the treasure house of his mighty ones. So what's interesting here is we read that Yahweh gave the king of his chosen people into the hands of his enemies, and he was being faithful to his covenant, because by this time the king and the commoners' covenant violations were just too much, and they had to fill the bitter end of which they were promised in consequence of their perpetual apostasy. And he also took some of the items from the house of Elohim that would have been the temple of Solomon. His grandson and successor, Belteshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar would have placed these items in his temples, but his grandson and successor, Belteshazzar, is eating straight from these in the dining hall, a banquet, a party, a reviling of... and he's essentially he's daring God to judge him, and he does judge him that very night. We can read of that in the 5th chapter. And the king said to Ashpenaz, the chief of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles. So he wanted the cream of the crop, the best of the best, not the poor, unwashed swine on the street, but he wanted the nobility and the royalty. So we can gather that Daniel was either or. He was of aristocratic stock. He would have been well born, and as such, he would have been subjected to the training course offered by the Babylonian rulers, which sought to make use of its captive subjects. Young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, having insight in all wisdom, having knowledge and understanding, knowledge capable to stand in the king's palace and teach them the writings and the speech of the Chaldeans. So these were young men who were to be impressive, physically speaking, in appearance, and to have insight, the ability to decipher and unlock certain text and certain items of information, capable of standing before the king's presence proudly and not bringing shame or attention away from the king. And they had to be bilingual, so they had to learn the language of the Chaldeans because they were on their territory now. And Aramaic, after this point, becomes the chosen street language of the Jewish people. That is a post-exilic fact. So the language that they were speaking street to street in the New Testament day was Aramaean. And the king appointed for them a daily ration of the king's food and of the wine, which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end thereof they should stand before the king. So this is a race with the 3-year part. He's going to train them and see how they look and how they present themselves at the end of the 3-year mark. And he's giving them he's monitoring their diet, and this is the diet, as we soon read, Daniel defies the diet. He remains true to the Mosaic dietary laws, and that's going to come up. Now among them were from the sons of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. So Daniel is the human protagonist of this book. He is a Judean. He would have been born at or near Jerusalem, and his 3 companions, who are better known henceforth by their Babylonian names that they are given, that we read of in the next verse. These are his 3 companions. They have their own adventures while there too. We can read of these in the 3rd chapters. They stand in a furnace of fire without being consumed, without being burned, and in so doing give a dramatic testimony and witness to the living Yahweh. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names, for he called Daniel Belteshazzar, and Hananiah Shadrach, and Mishael Micah, and Azariah and Abednego. So they changed their names, they changed their addresses, they changed their residence, they changed their language, they tried to change their standards, but they could not change their theology. So these names are all deferential to the Babylonian gods, whereas the Hebrew names are deferential to the Hebrew gods. Daniel, for instance, translates as El is my judge. Belteshazzar would have been similar but different to the name of Nebuchadnezzar's grandson and successor. And Hananiah, the tail end is Y-A-H, that's reference. Most of the prophets' names either end in the suffix L or Y-A-H. Mishael, that has an L ending, that is who is like L, is how that translates. And Azariah, once again, the Y-A-H suffix. So, but Daniel laid it upon his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's food, nor with the wine which he drank. So he asked of the chief of the eunuchs not to defile himself. So he was determined not to succumb to the culture around him, the dietary impositions. He wanted to remain true to the Mosaic law, which imposed certain dietary observations and standards. They couldn't eat swine or any seafood from that were bottom feeders. And so he's petitioning the chief of the eunuchs, which could be a delicate matter, but as we read in the next verse, Daniel, a lot of people just naturally liked him. He had a warm personality. And Elohim granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief of the eunuchs. So eunuchs would have been, it was not unusual for Oriental monarchs to employ eunuchs. These are because the royal seed could potentially, if people surrounding the king still had reproductive capabilities, they could conceivably impregnate his wife and so contaminate the royal line and raise one of their own. So it was not uncommon for them to demand eunuchs in their palace, and this wasn't uniform, so there's no reason to believe that Daniel or any of these other men who were in the king's service would have been demanded to be eunuchs. These would have been people more closer in his personal life. But the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my master the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you will be making my head guilty before the king. So he's a man under control and under authority. That authority is the king. The king dictated that this was to be the dietary standards. And he's worried that if after the 3-year mark, these men are not going to emerge more physically impressive and presentable before the king. So he has cause to fear for his security because getting on the king's wrath, making him mad, is not an investment. It seldom ends well for eunuch or any other servant of his. And Daniel said to the overseer, whom the chief of the eunuchs had put over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please try your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. So he's so confident in his dietary superiority that he doesn't need 3 years. He only needs 10 days, and he summons and requests the overseer, who is immediately under the chief of eunuch, who, even though he liked Daniel, he feared the king, and this prevented him from giving Daniel what he asked for. But Daniel prevailed over the overseer for an experimental period of 10 days. So worst case, it did what the chief eunuch feared. It made them less presentable, less wholesome, less healthy, but that could always be recovered. But as we read it, they do emerge the most healthy looking of all the boys. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearances of the young men who eat the portion of the king's food, and do with your servants as you see fit. So after the experiment is going to come the test, after the 10-day mark, they're going to see what he looks like and see what he is. And they're going to have the basis of comparison from everyone else. Everyone else is going to be fed the dietary standards imposed by the king, or at least someone close to him. And Daniel was going to do Daniel's ways on him and his 3 companions, and he's going to ask to be allowed to present themselves at the end of the 10-day mark. And he's has confident assurance that he will emerge in a positive light. And he listened to them in this matter and tried them 10 days. So he finally got someone to do what he wanted him to do. All he wanted was a chance to prove that the Jewish dietary law was superior to the Babylonian. And at the end of 10 days, their appearances looked better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's food. So their physical appearance and impression had improved after the 10-day mark, and it was noticeably, discernibly better from everyone else in the room, everyone else who was drafted for the king's service, the best and the brightest of the nobility of the conquered or dominated nations. And it came to be that the overseer took away the portion of food and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. So vegetables are a healthier, they're a wiser diet choice than wine or forbidden foods of sorts. So Daniel was a disciplined man. He had a disciplined prayer life. He had a disciplined diet. He was an intensely disciplined man. He had an acute sense of spiritual warfare, and the war would have been raging in this foreign land on anyone from the land of the Hebrews who entered into it. But he refused to compromise. And as for these 4 young men, Elohim gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So these 4 men were the most exceptional. They were the cream of the crop of Nebuchadnezzar and then later Cyrus's servants. But Daniel was the greatest of them all, on top of the foundation of knowledge and learning and wisdom. That would have been academic knowledge. They understood it instantly and totally. He also had the ability to interpret dreams, which is going to ultimately promote him to the prime minister position in the 2nd chapter, where we read in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, he's visited by a troubling dream, which he can't even remember, and he orders all of the wise men and the diviners to interpret them, but none of them can give him the answer. He's threatening to kill them all, and then Daniel steps into the rescue from a blank slate, not only recollects the dream, but tells him exactly what it means, and it does have far-reaching implications into the human history, the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of the days, when the king had said they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. So this is at the end of the 3-year period, which was originally designated to be the time during which they would have to prepare themselves to present themselves before the king. And the king spoke with them, and none among them were all found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they stood before the king. So these were the most impressive, the most presentable, these 4 Judean Hebrew men. When they spoke to him and looked at him, they blew the competition out of the water. They caught and attracted the eyes and ears of the king, in whose service they would find themselves, and they stood before him. And in any word of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians, the astrologers, who are all in his kingdom. Magicians and astrologers are among the forbidden practices. The occult and things of that nature are commanded to be expelled violently from the promised land of Israel in Deuteronomy 18. Yahweh doesn't want anything to do with them, and he doesn't want us to have anything to do with them, because they are dead-end traps to empty paths. But because they had the correct theology, because they were submitted to the omniscient source of all knowledge, they were able to answer this king to his satisfaction. Not only that, but several times over. And they established their superiority over all of the purveyors of esoteric knowledge. And Daniel continued until the 1st year of King Cyrus. So this is getting a little far ahead of ourselves. It's not until the 6th chapter where we read that the narrative transitions to the year of Persian control, and that's when Daniel really starts to be visited by dreams and visions of his own, and their interpretations have far-reaching effects. These are conversations in themselves which still pertain today, and I'll put it on my bucket list to maybe do one of these prophecies in the later end of Daniel. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. Bye-bye. See you then.